So we are going to start off how we've started off everyone so far and just reading 1 Corinthians 8:1b. So we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. And so that is our hope with these conversations is not puffing up our knowledge, not debating, not arguing, but actually just gleaning from each other in love and listening to people who have studied things way more than I have and probably more than a lot of you have. So I'm excited today. I get to introduce you to my Briarcrest president. So this is Dr. Pawelke, and I was in my second year of Bible college, I believe, when Dr. Pawelke started. And yeah, I've got to see him be the president there for a long time. And I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, Dr. Pawelke, but my favorite memory of you was there's a coffee shop in the main academic building at Briarcrest. And I was walking past it, and there's this time when everybody just walks extremely fast because, you know, you're a couple minutes till class and everyone's trying to bustle into their class. And Dr. Pawelke's there just sweeping something up. Something was dirty, and so he picked up a broom and swept it up. And I still remember that. Was it 4 or 5 years later? And I think that brings us really well into what we're talking about today, which is discipleship. So I guess before we get too far into that, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about yourself, Dr. Pawelke, and yeah, why maybe I asked you for discipleship?
Well, thanks for inviting me on to your conversation here, Austin. And let me just say at the outset, I love the verse you read, because knowledge and education is so helpful as we change the way we think. It changes the way we live. But knowledge has that risk of turning into pride. And I'm so glad you start your talks this way. I commend you. But I'll just give you a little bit of a snapshot, Austin. I was not raised in a Christian home, but I came to Christ when my parents were splitting up. I'd been given a little Gideon New Testament in elementary school. I dug that little elementary school New Testament out, and I started reading it, and I trusted Christ in the midst of all the turmoil that my family was going through. And just from that little New Testament, starting to read the scriptures and letting it sink into my life, even though I didn't understand a lot of it, but what I did understand, I was processing. And my mother and I eventually moved away to the city. In our case, it was Toronto. And I went to a few different churches that I knew, well, Christians should do two things. They should read their Bible and should go to church, even though I was not raised in a Christian home. But God, through some incredibly providential experiences, brought me to a really wonderful evangelical Bible-believing church. And there in that church, I found they had a Sunday school class for teens. I was a young teen now. And this Sunday school teacher built a relationship with me, and one Friday night said, "Hey, can I take you out for pizza?" And that started a discipleship relationship with me, where he poured his life. I don't think he ever used the word discipleship, but he fed me books, and he got me in the Word, and he challenged me and encouraged me, and became really a profoundly influential person in my life. And here's what I think: a lot of people don't disciple the way they weren't discipled. But people who have had others pour into them, they know the benefit, the profound benefit that they've experienced. And so those people are usually more willing to and more responsive to the process of discipleship because they've known the experience. Mm-hmm. But others who haven't, they're not sure where to start. But that was my introduction to discipleship, a caring man who was a Sunday school teacher, a business guy, and poured into my life.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and I completely agree. I think it's easier to think about discipleship when it has happened to you and you've seen the benefits and you've seen how someone like this guy loving on you has affected your life. So Yeah, so Dr. Pawelke actually wrote a book on discipleship, and so that's going to be a lot of where I'm referring to and just asking questions about this. And right before we went live, I was actually mentioning to him how I think discipleship is extremely important, but especially for people who grew up in a Christian home and who have attended church their whole lives. As soon as we hear discipleship, we get our Christianese dictionary in there, and we almost skip over what it actually means, because I guess maybe this is one of those instances where we say discipleship and we say it so often and mean it for so many things that it has almost lost its meaning and its grip on things. So I'm hoping that with our conversation today, we can really dig in deep to what discipleship is. But the first thing that I want to talk about, so in your book, you mentioned a lot of King Solomon's writings. And you had a quote here: God has implanted into the human a void and longing. Inside all of us, we know we're made for eternity, for something more, but we struggle to find it. Could you talk a little bit about that void, and just, is that for everyone? Is it for Christians? Is it just for non-Christians? Or what did you mean by that?
Well, I think at the very core, the way we've been created is that we are hardwired for relationship with our Almighty, with God. And in fact, there have been studies, secular studies, to show how children are hardwired for community, for relationship. But I'd like to take that another level, that I think at the very core, for what it means to be human, there's this deep longing for something more. Yeah. And of course, in Adam, in the fall, that was all damaged, that was all bent, that was broken, that was severed. But there was still this hunger, this longing for something that was now missing. Mm-hmm. I think it was Augustine who said, and this is not a direct quote, but basically, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Yeah. And there is this emptiness that certainly as non-Christians, we're seeking, we're searching, and we fill it through all kinds of counterfeits. I mean, we are, it's been said, we're idol factories, but we're constantly, whether it's through relationship or through power or through pleasure or through control or through money, or there are all kinds of elixirs which grab our attention, and they feed us for a while, mm-hmm. but they eventually leave us wanting. And we think, oh, more might be better. It's not better. It at some point, we kind of experience a bottoming out experience. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, we're not satisfied till we encounter God. Now, unfortunately, though, I think, and this is the beauty of discipleship, it speaks of an ongoing learning relationship with God, because sometimes as believers, we can encounter God, we get to know God, we put our faith in Christ, but then we still dabble in these other worlds, which are not unimportant, but they're never designed to meet that deep longing. Yeah. And so a disciple is somebody who has a living, dynamic, ongoing, learning, growing, maturing relationship with Christ. And as long as I'm feeding that, there'll be a sense of wholeness. And if I'm not feeding that, there'll be a sense of emptiness. And I'm going to look for that filling somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see that I was going to say in people's lives, in my own life, right? You can see that when you're not filling that up with Christ or with God, you fill it with something, right? You don't just leave it empty. You continuously try to fill it with other things that will never actually fill that hole, which leads people down a different paths, right? Trying to fill it with different things. And yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And is discipleship something that you can do? I liked how you worded it. It's a continually growing and continually learning towards God in that. Can that be done individually, I guess? Like if you wanted to just be a disciple, you go to church, you read your Bible, like you said, and you are growing in that way. Can you be a hermit and do that on your own?
Well, it's one of those yes and no answers in this sense. The Apostle Paul, when he had his Damascus Road experience, And he discovered the folly and error of his legalism and in his ways of persecuting the church. But he went into a lengthy season of relative isolation. Now his story is unique, but I think there are times and seasons where we grow in solitude. There's a passage, it escapes me exactly where, but there's a passage where David, and in his case it was with Jehovah, but where he had a season where some marauding groups had come upon his camp, taken the women and children away, and his own men were frustrated and angry with him. And it said he fed himself alone in the Lord, and he had to minister to his own soul by himself. So there are seasons where there is a sense of aloneness and alienation, but that isn't the general rule, and that isn't the ideal. God has given us this wonderful gift of a community, and the body of Christ is a community. And that's when we most grow, because it's in the context of relationship where I see my shortcomings, where people affirm me for my gifts and my strengths, and it's in the community where we blossom and grow. But there will be seasons where we might find ourselves more alone, and there's a different lesson God has for us in that particular season. But as a general rule, we grow in community, and that's God's plan.
Yeah, I appreciate that you said it was both and, because I think our quick answer can be just like, no, like we need community. We need to always be with people, but like you said, you shared a couple of examples there. Jesus also sought solitude, and I mean for shorter times, but still he sought that time to just be with himself and God. So we have a comment here. We were made to have a personal relationship with God. When we try to fill that space with anything else, it will leave us wanting, as it does not fulfill the real desire. And I think that kind of comes in with being made in the image of God, right? And just that relationship that we as people have. And then, yeah, like we were saying before, filling with other things, almost like filling, putting a square in a block that's supposed to be meant for a circle, right? It's just not quite fitting it. You also had another quote here that I wanted to share. God cares enough to be involved with us. And that one is a truth that I think a lot of us know, but we often forget. It's something that we often wonder, if God is all powerful, if God is not controlling, but can do anything, then how come we need to do anything at all? Like, can't we just leave that in his hands? And without getting into a Calvinist or Arminianist discussion in this, can you just talk about that invitation to be a part of that? I know I've been reading N.T. Wright lately, and he talks a lot about being involved in the restoration process of creation and what that looks like.
Well, Austin, that's an enormous question which theologians continue to wrestle with. And I think there's real value in certainly, first and foremost, wrestling with the scriptures. And then it's helpful to read how other people explain or frame it and understand it. But I'll tell you how I approach it, and it works for me. I think it's consistent with theological truth and biblical truth, but I'll tell you how I understand it. So first I'll say this. When I say God cares enough to be involved, that in itself is a significant statement, because it drives me crazy when we hear celebrities saying, "Oh, I love you," to the audience after they've received their award. Well, there may be some level of affection, maybe some level of empathy that, I like this crowd of people. And we're guilty of that too, where we say, we care about people, we care about the homeless, we care about the disadvantaged, the ill-treated, and there may be a level of empathy. But when I actually do something, that's a demonstration that I care. And the beauty of God is that God's love for us, God's care for us, isn't an abstraction. He does put flesh to it in the incarnation of Christ, but he he demonstrates it by being involved in our lives. God is not distant. We are not deists, and deism is basically the view that God everything started and then left. No, God's involved, and he's involved in your life, Austin, in my life, in all of your members of your church. God is involved in people.
Mm-hmm.
So here's how I understand the interaction between the human and the divine. And I'm a firm believer in the sovereignty of God, that God is in control, that nothing takes God by surprise. And when I think of the whole issue of sovereignty and free will, I like to think of it as two orbits. From the human perspective, I have to make good choices. And from God's perspective, God is God, and he's orchestrating events. But here's how I look at it functionally, okay? When I step out in obedience, God enables and empowers me to complete it. And here's some biblical examples which I think validate that. There's a story, it escapes me exactly where, but there's a story where these lepers are saying to Jesus, heal us, please heal us. And Jesus simply says to these lepers, go show yourself to the priests. He doesn't say you're healed. He just says, go show yourself to the priests. Why? Because the priests would then declare them now clean, and now you can enter into community again.
Mm-hmm.
And the passage says, as they went, they were healed. And so had they not started to go towards the priests, the implication would be there wasn't faith, and there wasn't obedience, there wasn't initiative, they wouldn't have been healed. But here, they obeyed, and they then experienced healing. When I think of Joshua, I think it's Joshua 3, the people of Israel at the Jordan River. And the Jordan River at that time was at flood level. And it could have been up to, a mile wide, possibly in flood level. And they were going into the promised land. And the priests at the back say, okay, we want to get the Ark of the Covenant in the front. And when the priests put their, step into the water, and we want the priests to cross the Jordan River. Well, everybody's going, we're not crossing the river. It's at flood level. We're not going to make it. We're going to be all swept away. But it says, as they stepped into the water stopped. So it didn't happen until they stepped out. Mm. And I think there's one more passage I'll give you in Philippians 2 where it talks about working out our salvation, but then it says, but it's God who is at work in you to will and to do according to his good pleasure. And so we had this beautiful dynamic where we need God to empower us. We need God to strengthen us. We need God to infuse life and energy into us. But he waits till we take that first step. Mm-hmm. So when I step out in faith and obedience, then God steps in, if you will. Yeah. And that's how I, in my mind, think of this divine interaction between human and the divine.
Yeah, that imagery of the priests needing to step into the water first. I mean, that'd be scary. You're literally stepping off an edge, right? And just trusting in God completely. I guess I strive to be that faithful in that way. But I don't know if you knew this. When I was in between ministries, I worked construction for a little bit. And the reason that I loved construction was that I had a plan. I had a building that needed to be built, and I knew how to do it. And then I did the building. And you could step back and say, like, either this building is good, I built it like structurally sound, or I didn't do a good job, we need to redo this. When we talk about discipleship, it's not like that, and it's much harder to not necessarily track progress, but to know if we need to go further or if we need to do more, right? And not that this is a work-based thing, but discipleship, as you said, was continuously moving towards God. And there's two ways that we can do it. We can feel like we're not moving fast enough, and then we'll go more towards work-based and kind of doing things so that we are saved, or we can say, well, I was moving towards God and I'm okay just moving slowly towards him, but I also want to dabble in these things like we talked about. And so that gets hard. Can you maybe talk about that tension of knowing when you're being just a good enough disciple, I guess, or
Sure.
what that's like?
Well, I'll tackle your question from a few different perspectives, a few different vantage points.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I think sometimes we think of discipleship as this is for the really committed, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's exactly how disciple is being used in the scripture, at least not always. Disciple at its simplest level is a learner. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the Great Commission is to go make disciples, so evangelize them and help them grow in the faith. But I do think the scriptures use a number of different synonyms to describe what discipleship is. So to me, commitment, lordship, sanctification, being filled with the Spirit, walking in the Spirit. These are all nuanced words. They all have meaning, but I think they're all representative of a more serious, a more devoted, a more demonstrative, dynamic faith. Mm. And I think 1 Corinthians 3 talks about the spiritual person compared to the carnal person. So I think there's a number of different words used in Scripture to describe the more serious follower of Christ. And I do think there are seasons where we are less serious. That's not good, but it is a reality. We hit flat seasons. Mm-hmm. And tragically, many people who first come to Christ are not discipled well and flounder for a bit. But here's what I'll say about intentional discipleship. Mm-hmm. and non-intentional discipleship. Many believers who at least go to church regularly, maybe help out with some volunteer ministry from time to time, maybe connect with a small group. Over enough years, they're going to put together a little bit of a Christian worldview. It'll have holes, but over enough time, the result will be somewhat of a mature relationship with Christ. Yeah. And they've been discipled. I think it was Rick Warren who said they're discipled by divine accident. I know it's a bit of an oxymoron, but the point is there was no methodology. It was just after enough time, they learned enough truths and enough lessons, enough experiences that they kind of grew a little bit more mature. Yeah. But when a person is invited into a discipleship relationship by a mature believer, so it's a new believer and a mature believer invites them into a discipleship relationship, and there's an intentionality about it. And they talk about let's get you in the Word, and let's teach you about prayer, and let's teach you about the importance of community in church, and let's talk about the importance of service and giving, and living out our faith in practice, and there's some intentional biblical lessons along the way, and we actually learn theology. Who is God and what's he like, and who is Christ and how is he the God-man, and what does the Holy Spirit do, and what is the nature of salvation, and how do we grow, and that's our sanctification, and what's the nature of the church, and what's the nature of evil and the work of the devil. And there's a systematic nature to content. And we're talking about how this relates to marriage and to parenting and to work and to citizenship, citizenry. There's an intention. So a person can conceivably be discipled much more quickly because they were invited into a very intentional process. Mm-hmm. Now, even for the person who goes through an intentional process, and frankly, that's what somewhat Bible schools do, somewhat at some level, or intensive theological kinds of discipleship institutes. Yeah. But discipleship also is layers, right? So we might find ourselves in a more mature relationship with God, but I'll tell you, Austin, the longer I walk with Jesus, and I want to be understood carefully here, the more I see my need for Christ. Like I am a selfish, sinful person. Mm. And so I know on one level, I'm more mature as a Christian today than I was 30 years ago or 50 years ago. Well, not 50. I wasn't a believer 50 years ago. But, you know, I'm hopefully more, but there's also a sense in which, wow, the more I grow in Christ, the more I see I need to keep growing, because there's all kinds of crevices and corners that I haven't really sufficiently relinquished lordship to him. So I think there's an intentionality, but there's also a sense in which it's a bottomless well to grow, and we keep growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you made a comment right at the beginning there that discipleship is not for the further along Christian, or the I don't know, Christian that's been there for a couple of years, that's baptized, you know. And I think that's an important thing to say, because we can think that I'm not a disciple. I'm just learning about God right now. And that's exactly what a disciple is, right? And we almost think of different levels of Christians in that way. And once you reach a certain level, then you can become a disciple. And then once you reach another level, then we'll let you get baptized. Whereas biblically, it's very much like, hey, like, you believe in Christ? Like, come celebrate with us. We're all the worst sinners. So and I love Paul, because he goes on like all his writings, and then all of a sudden he says, sinners, of who I am the worst. Yeah. It's like, but you're teaching us, like, if you were teaching a church, that's not necessarily what you would want to say in the middle of your sermon, right? And so, no, I appreciate your comment in that. So thank you. Yeah, can you discuss the Greek word for church? You talk about that in your book a little bit, the translation of called out ones.
Yes. So the Greek word for church is ek out, ekklesia, and it literally means called out ones, called out from something. It's most often used to describe an assembly, but it describes people. It describes a community. Now, there's two important things that help us in word studies when we study the scriptures, study any text for that matter, is what's the etymology of the word? How do we understand the origins of this? What does this word actually mean? And so in the case of church, it means called out, ekklesia, to call out, okay? But the other thing that helps define words is context. And so whenever the scriptures use the word church, let's look at the context. And here's what we see about the word church, or ekklesia. It's always used in the context of people, not building. Now, I don't get all stressed out when people talk about going to church, but technically it's the people. I love to see those signs. Sometimes you'll see in churches where it says, Liberty Church meets here, you know. In other words, they happen to meet in this building right now. And so, you know, it's a symbolism at work, but it's a helpful symbolism. But in the scriptures, ekklesia, church, was always used talking of people. Now, here's something else interesting. Most often, it's describing a particular local assembly, a particular gathering. And that's why we use the word local church, meaning a particular gathering. And then Paul gave instructions to Titus and to Timothy. You know, every church should have elders, and there should be some level of structure, and then you recognize the Lord's Supper, and, you know, there's ordinances. There was always structure to this gathering. 3 people having coffee at Starbucks does not constitute a church. But there's a local assembly, there's a gathering together, there's some sense of structure, there's some leadership, there's purpose and mission involved. But you also see the word church describing people who believe that in some cases aren't even alive anymore. And so this would be the universal church. So there's a real sense in which your local church and my local church is also part of the Acts 2 church, in that we're part of the universal church that transcends history, transcends time, from the beginning of Pentecost, and we're linked with believers in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in South America, and that's the universal church. But here's the one other thing I'll say is the church wasn't just people, it was people who have trusted Christ. It was the called out ones, those called out from the world into a dynamic living faith relationship with Jesus Christ. So it's people, it's Christian people, it's reflected in a local level, and it also includes a larger universal expression, not universalism, but a universal sense of believers all around the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we want to get into the creeds, we can just call it the Catholic Church, the universal church in that sense.
Precisely, exactly.
Yeah, and so talking about the church, another quote from your book: the church has a mission, a purpose, and a reason. And this helps me quite a bit when I think of my church, of Cornerstone. It's not here to serve me, right? I'm not, especially. So when I came to when I came to Saskatoon, I wasn't working at a church. I was working elsewhere, and so I did the classic Christian church shopping, right? The looking around, and it's very difficult not to look at what churches can provide for you. But just to think about how we are the church, and we're there to be a part of it, to be actively working out that purpose and that mission and that reason, and not just soaking it in and then never letting go of it. And so can you maybe expand on what the church's mission and purpose and reason, those three points are?
Sure. Let me answer that by going to an earlier comment that you referenced by telling a bit of a story. And it illustrates the ideal, really. Before coming to Briarcrest, I pastored a church for 19 years in Burlington, Ontario. But before that, my wife and I planted a church in Winnipeg for 8 years. And when we were in the early stage of planting the church, we were new in the community, and we wanted to reach the community, reach lost people. And we met some people a few doors down that were believers. We invited them over for a meal. We had a good conversation, and I shared the vision of our church. And we didn't have a core. Like, my wife and I were the core. It was that was it. And we're building core, but like there was no gatherings yet. And as I shared this with these Christian people, they came back and said, "We've prayed about it, and we've decided to join you." And it was like, wow, they don't know if I can preach. They don't know if our music's going to be any good. They don't know if they're going to like the building we rent. They don't know. I mean, they knew theologically where we're at and where our faith was, but there was a lot they didn't know about the church. They were not consumers. They came because of mission. Yeah. They came because what we were talking about, we want to be a biblical church, a New Testament kind of church, and that resonated with them. Here's what unites all people today, whether you're millennial or Gen X or a builder or a boomer or whatever sociological language you want to use. We're all consumers. Mm-hmm. And it's inescapable. We just think this way. And wherever we go, we think, do I like this? And when we get our burger, we say, lettuce, tomato, onions, no mayo. And when we get mayo, we're upset because, we said no mayo. And we're all consumers. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the church, we come to church and we think, well, we place ourselves in the center and the spotlight's on us and we want to be served. And that's just so ingrained in our cultural minds. Yeah. And all of us, we think this way. But we need to think completely differently about the church. The church is on a mission. Mm-hmm. And the mission we have is the Great Commission. In fact, I think if you could sum up the mission of the church in its simplest language, and all churches should have this as its mission, we're about the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. The Great Commandment, of course, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbors yourself. And the Great Commission is to go make disciples. And if you're doing those two things, that's the mission of the church. Right. And so then when you start teasing out its purpose and its reason, of course, some churches might have a more distinctive purpose in the sense that you might be situated in a particular locale where you're working with a lot of disadvantaged people because it's an urban setting and its context dictates such. Or maybe you're in another setting where you're working with it's a university town and you're working with university students just because of the setting. So there might be some unique, distinct nuance to your purpose, but your mission remains the same. And so what we've got to do is we've got to think more missionally that when I come to church, I'm donning, a worker's vest. Yeah. and a hard hat, because I'm now rolling up my sleeves to become a participant. Now I'm blessed in the process, and there's community, and there's friendship, and there's lots of good things that are byproducts that I'm going to experience. But I'm there to become part of something. Mm-hmm. So when you think of it this way, the ultimate mission of the church is not the people that are part of the church. The ultimate mission of the church is the people that we need to reach. Mm-hmm. So when I gather with the community, we want to build each other up. We want to honor God. We want to worship. We want to grow in instruction. We want to experience community. We want to have fellowship. But all of that is so that we can reach out and see that community grow with lost people, because that's the goal, is redemption. It's the reconciling people with God. And so we've got to break this mindset where people come to church and say, well, I want particular kind of music, particular kind of preaching, a particular kind of structure, particular kind of liturgy, or whatever it may be. And I'm not saying we don't have taste. I'm not, but that's of much lesser significance. Mm-hmm. What my goal should be, I want to come to a place which is thinking bigger than itself. We're about something bigger than just ourselves. We're about reaching Saskatoon. We're about reaching this community. We're about reaching this people group. We're about those that aren't yet a part of us. And yes, in the process, you're blessed and ministered to, and you grow. But we best grow when we're serving and giving and we're looking beyond ourselves. And that's what the church has to recapture. And healthy churches have that, but ingrown churches, that's a telltale sign that a church is ingrown, is when they've lost sight of a vision for outward thinking.
Yeah, and that changes your action within the church as well, right? Because if you are there to, if all your members are there to take, right, and the critiquing, and I think the online world of like live streaming has made that even more difficult, because like there was a time, because we pre-recorded services, I could literally do the Sunday service, and then as soon as it was over, I changed the channel to a TV show, right? Like I didn't change spots on the couch at all. I just went back, and then I got to switch. But anyways, if you're
that's
like
a courageous confession, Austin.
It's here forever, so it's perfect. If you're like that and you're just there to please your people, then it's completely different than if you are there. Like you said, I love that imagery of putting on a worker's vest. And now I just want to go and buy a bunch of workers' vests for people that come into the church. But you're basically pushing the church, right? You want to be a part of that. You're using the gifts that you're given to expand the church and grow the church, not necessarily just in numbers, but growing the people inside the church as well, and pushing them to further discipleship. So we're going to talk about that in staff meeting sometime, about just buying a whole bunch of hard hats and
good for you. Austin, let me make another connection here to where we started our conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think within all humans, being made in the image of God, is this longing for relationship, and that's the void, right, that we started talking about.
Yeah. But
there's also hunger for responsibility. There's a hunger for relationship and a hunger for responsibility. We want to do something with our lives, and one of the most the two most tragic things that a person can experience is a lack of relationship, acceptance, love. To be alone is horrible. But the other thing that's deathly destructive is to have no purpose, is to have no meaning. And this is what is so tragic for example, so many seniors. They feel like they no longer work, they've lost their purpose. And here's where the church has such a potential ministry opportunity to breathe life and meaning into post-work years, to give them ministry and opportunities to serve. But when a person feels they have no contribution to make, no purpose, no sense of meaning, that leaves them with such a void. Whereas to come to the church and say, okay, this is about relationship, vertically with God and horizontally with people, but it's also about responsibility. It's about purpose. It's about mission. And that's the beauty of spiritual gifts. And when we help people volunteer, when we help people serve, we're not just, filling out a strategic plan and, filling all the boxes of needs, but we're helping people find a sense of meaning and purpose in their calling. And that's a wonderful place to be.
So I'm going to move to our next question here, but I wanted to admit something. I lied to you at the beginning of this because I said that my favorite memory of you was you sweeping. But I just remembered my actual favorite memory happened September 2nd, 2017. And we met in Home Depot. And you probably don't remember this, but I remember the specific date because it was on my wedding day. And I had to explain to you why I was in Home Depot the morning of my wedding, because I was killing time with my groomsmen. And so that popped into my head as we were talking.
That's great. That's great.
I guess that shows the difference between the bride and the groom. Hey, we're killing time the morning of, and I'm sure she was not.
Great story.
Yeah, so another quote here. When we make Christ and his kingdom purposes our primary focus, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the church's mission, all other needs are secondary, even our need for food, for clothing, and health. I love this quote. I think that it is a very bold quote. I think it's a true quote. It's very bold in our selfishness, because we are selfish people who have a hard time with this. And but I wanted to ask you, do you think that it's feasible? Like how does that work in our everyday life?
Right. So I'll speak a little bit abstractly, but I'll try to make it as real as possible and try to illustrate it. Certainly the concept is rooted in Matthew 6, where Jesus talks about not worrying and seek first the kingdom of God, and then everything else will be added to you. So it speaks to that absolute uncompromising devotion and focus. But here's where I think it has significance. When I wake up in the morning and my first thought or my priority, and by the way, priority was always a word used in its singular form till the early 1900s. You never used the word priorities before the 1900s. It was always priority. It was the one. It was the first. But sticking with that, if the focus of my life is always first on glorifying God, on living out my sense of purpose and mission today in what I do, everything else becomes secondary. It's not that everything else is unimportant, but it's that everything else becomes secondary. So we're in a prosperous world right now. And so to say that that's more important than food is kind of, it's kind of not a fair illustration, because we have food. But here's where I'll meddle a bit. And Austin, I might be taking a bit of a risk here in this conversation.
I like it.
But here we're in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay. And all we talk about is the pandemic. We talk about COVID-19. We talk about people we know that have had it. We're talking about the vaccines. We're talking about lockdowns. We're talking about government decisions. And I'm not remotely trying to address any of those specific positions we might have in those themes.
Mm-hmm.
But that becomes our consuming conversation. Whereas if our focus is, I have a relationship with the living God, and today I want to live my life in a way that causes people's attention to look Godward.
Mm-hmm.
And when that's my focus, then my conversation is going to be different. My perspective is going to be different. I'm not going to be paralyzed by my own worries and fears of the pandemic and of COVID-19. And it affects the disposition of my life, of my countenance, of my language, of my conversation, of everything. And that's going to make a difference. Whereas if I live at the lesser level, worry over the pandemic, or worry for food, or worry about my job, that's where I'm going to live.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what I'm trying to say, or what I think Jesus is trying to say in Matthew 6, when I live in a framework of life which is so trusting, that doesn't have to be complicated or complex, but it's the priority. Then everything else is secondary. So it's not that you no longer think about food, or think about the pandemic, or your job, or challenges with the home, or whatever it may be. But what consumes your thinking, what guides your thinking, what preoccupies your thinking is something higher, something bigger. And that creates a kind of rest.
Mm-hmm.
It creates a disposition of trust.
Yeah.
So that's how I meant it.
Yeah, no, I think that ties it in really well and clarifies it. And just even when we are thinking about those things, that priority is forming everything still, right? And no, I appreciate that. I wanted to talk about, you had 3 simple steps or strategies for evangelism. And evangelism is something that I've thought about particularly a lot in the last couple of months. And maybe it's COVID and just what that's looked like, and just how much more difficult it is, because you can't just walk up to somebody on the street anymore without them being afraid, right? But it's something that I find extremely important. And I know that in the tradition that I have grown up in, we focused a lot more on internal, I guess, of the church rather than looking outwards. But so your 3 strategies were dedication, and your quote here, Peter tells us to set apart or sanctify Christ in our lives, and then training and strategy. Did you want to maybe, like, if you could give a quick rundown of those 3 and just how that can help us evangelize, and then this ties in really well with what we're talking about with the priority, and this kind of is the fruit that comes from that, I think.
Sure. So my 3 movements of dedication and strategy and training that grows out of 1 Peter chapter 3, I think it's 15 and 16. And basically Peter says, set apart Christ as Lord. And then he says, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that is within you. And then he says, but do so with gentleness and respect. So when I parse that down and break it down into language of today, to set apart, that's the word sanctify, okay, or dedicate. And so what Peter's saying is the first thing we need to do is make sure you have, a rich, dynamic, living relationship with Christ. And that's walking as a disciple, walking in step with the Spirit, lordship. It's all that dynamic at work. So there's dedication. I'm missional. I want to reach lost people. There's honest empathy and love and care and concern and burden. But then he says, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that was within you. So there's some training. There's some education. And so I think to be an effective witness today, the more we understand culture, and it's not that we need to get a degree in philosophy, but there's certain things we better be able to grapple with. What does Islam believe? Why do we believe in the uniqueness of Christ? What is distinctive Christ compared to Muhammad or Buddha or other world religions. What's happening in our woke culture today, and how do we, how is Christianity differ? How does it differ from the cultural context and the values that permeate today? And why is it we believe in forgiveness rather than cancel culture? So the more we understand the world in which we're situated, the ideologies and the belief systems that are around us, so that when people ask us a question, we can actually give a somewhat intelligent answer, whether it might be a little bit of science, a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of world religions. And I don't think this needs to be an overwhelming level of training and education, but I think to equip ourselves. So there's dedication, there's training, and then strategy. He says, but do so with gentleness and respect. I love those two words because packaging matters. How we deliver the message matters, and that matters. Awesome, you're married, how you say something to your wife matters, right? And the way we relate to non-believers and to lost people matters. And we should be gentle and respect. In fact, when you look at how Jesus related to people, Jesus was harsh and demonstrative and firm with who? The Pharisees, the people who knew better. Yeah. But the woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, Zacchaeus, the early callings of the disciples, lepers, there was grace, there was kindness, there was welcome. He talked about sin, but there was an empathy and a sensitivity and a gentleness with those who were hurting and hungry and knew they were hurting. Mm-hmm. So to me, gentleness and respect, because curiously, if I can say this right, does God respect our will? Well, kind of, in that he gave us a will and he wants us to choose to follow him. Yeah. And so in the same way, we shouldn't browbeat or try to win arguments. We should have a respectful dialogue with people about Christianity. So that's why I say dedication. As we love God, we love people. Training, in the sense there's a little bit of preparedness, and strategy. There needs to be gentleness and respect. This dance between the two. Yeah. Now, having just said that, Austin, I'll just offer one more thing. Mm-hmm. That can sound like, oh, I've got to take all these courses in how to do evangelism, and so I'll say yes, there's value in learning how to be a good witness. But let me just say that being a witness is simply telling what we've experienced. Mm. And I love the story of the woman at the well. Jesus engages this Samaritan woman. And you recall the conversation, normally Jews don't speak to Samaritan. Usually men don't speak to women. And Jesus engages this woman at the well. And he talks to her about the deeper creational need in her life. He says, well, let's go get your husband. And he says, well, you've had 5 husbands. And so there's this dialogue going on, because Jesus is trying to help this woman see that your pursuit of relationships isn't going to meet your need. Mm. It's not going to satisfy the void that we talked about earlier. And then he talks about living water. And this conversation unfolds that changes this woman's life. And what does she do? The very first thing she does is evangelism. The passage in John 4 says she goes back to her community, back to her town, and says, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? Mm-hmm. And so what's beautiful there is she had all kinds of questions. She had just encountered living water. She had just encountered the Messiah. But all she knew was, I need to tell others about this. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think there's any necessary prerequisite to evangelism beyond your own faith. Tell your story, however simple it might be. Yeah. But I would say, as we grow as disciples, then we should be as effective a witness as possible. And that's where dedication and training and strategy comes in. But boy, evangelism can start with just, this is what I've experienced, this is what I saw. Come see a man.
Mm-hmm. I think strategy is one that really sticks with me. And I know, like, in my life, as soon as I start to debate with someone, I dig in deeper, right? you may have all of the facts, but we started debating, so I'm not moving from my spot. This is an argument that I am going to try to win no matter what. Whereas when someone comes to me in love and has that conversation, it's a completely different process, right? And it's a softening of heart rather than a hardening. But no, I appreciate those three. We are running out of time here, so I think I'm going to wrap it up a little bit. I wanted to thank you, Dr. Pawelke. Thank you so much for just talking about discipleship and what that looks like. I mean, the whole point of the name Short Talks on Long Conversations is that we can only scratch the surface on something that we could have a whole class on, maybe. That's a future thing. But no, I just wanted to say I really appreciate it. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll throw my email up there, so you can email me. And Dr. Pawelke actually made the mistake of giving me his email and phone number, so I will pass on all the questions to him if you have them. And yeah, I want to make sure that we can continue this conversation, even if it's not online or it's not through email. Even we can talk at church sometime as well with different questions. But again, thank you very much, Dr. Pawelke. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Austin. Great connecting with you again. All the best to you and your ministry as well.
Right.